At my sister's engagement party in front of about 180 guests at the prestigious Westfield Country Club, my husband of 14 years looked at me with pure hatred in his eyes and shouted, "Apologize to her or get out." He was absolutely certain I would crumble. He expected tears, begging, maybe even me dropping to my knees in front of everyone who mattered in our social circle. But I stood up calmly, walked across that elegant marble-floored ballroom, looked him straight in the eye, and said one single sentence. One sentence that would systematically dismantle everything he thought he'd built. One sentence that would expose not just him, but the entire web of lies, manipulation, and financial fraud he'd been orchestrating. One sentence that would take both him and his so-called business partner down in flames so complete, so thorough, that neither of them would ever recover from the devastation I was about to unleash. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. If you're hearing this, hit subscribe right now because the drama that unfolds is about to expose a conspiracy so intricate, so calculated, that it makes most infidelity stories look like children's fairy tales. And please leave a comment below. If you were standing in that ballroom surrounded by 180 of your most important people, watching your own husband side with another woman over you, demanding you apologize for something that would destroy your family's reputation, how would you have responded? What would you have said when faced with that level of public humiliation? I'm Dr. Natalie Reeves, a forensic accountant and financial crimes investigator for one of the most respected consulting firms in the Pacific Northwest. For the past 12 years, I've specialized in uncovering corporate embezzlement, tracking hidden assets, and exposing sophisticated financial fraud schemes that most people never see coming. My clients include Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and high-net-worth individuals who suspect someone is stealing from them. What I do for a living requires an analytical mind, an eye for patterns that others miss, and the patience to build airtight cases that can withstand scrutiny in federal court. On that particular Saturday evening in late September, I was standing in the Westfield Country Club's grand ballroom, wearing an elegant navy silk dress and my grandmother's pearl necklace, celebrating my younger sister Juliana's engagement to her longtime boyfriend. The club was decorated with thousands of white roses and crystal chandeliers, creating an atmosphere of refined luxury that perfectly matched our family's expectations for such occasions. About 180 people had gathered to celebrate. Family members, close friends, business associates, and prominent members of our Seattle community who had known our family for decades. My husband, Dr. Garrett Blackthorne, stood near the open bar wearing his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the one that made him look distinguished and successful, exactly the image he'd cultivated as a prominent orthopedic surgeon at Seattle Presbyterian Hospital. He was deep in conversation with a woman I'd never seen before, someone whose presence at my sister's engagement party struck me as odd from the moment I noticed her. She was stunning in an obvious way. Platinum blonde hair styled in perfect waves, wearing a designer red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and jewelry that caught the light with every calculated gesture she made. But what bothered me wasn't her appearance. What bothered me was how comfortable she seemed, how she carried herself like she belonged in our world, and most tellingly, how my husband was looking at her with an expression I hadn't seen him wear in years. The woman had introduced herself earlier as Raven Sterling, supposedly a business consultant who was exploring investment opportunities in the medical device industry. She claimed to have mutual connections with some of Garrett's colleagues, which explained her invitation to such a personal family celebration. But something about her story didn't add up. Her knowledge of medical devices seemed superficial when I listened to her conversations. Her supposed business connections were vague when pressed for details. And most suspiciously, she seemed to know far too much about Garrett's schedule, his preferences, and his recent professional activities for someone who was supposedly a new acquaintance. As a forensic accountant, I'd learned to trust my instincts about people who didn't quite fit their own narratives. I'd spent years investigating individuals who presented polished exteriors while hiding complex deceptions underneath. Raven Sterling triggered every professional alarm I developed over more than a decade of exposing financial criminals and sophisticated con artists. But what happened next went beyond mere suspicion. What happened next revealed the true scope of what I was actually dealing with, and why my response would need to be far more strategic than anyone in that ballroom could have possibly imagined. The confrontation began when my Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister and one of the most respected philanthropists in Seattle, approached me with a concerned expression during the cocktail hour before dinner was served. "Natalie, dear," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we wouldn't be overheard, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take offense. That woman with Garrett, the blonde in the red dress, is she someone you know? Because she's been asking very specific questions about your family's financial situation, your property holdings, and your investment portfolios. Questions that seem far too detailed for casual conversation at an engagement party." My blood went cold. Professional investigators asking about family finances at social events wasn't normal networking behavior. It was reconnaissance behavior. It was the kind of information gathering that preceded sophisticated financial crimes. That was the moment I realized that whatever was happening between my husband and Raven Sterling went far beyond a simple affair. That was the moment I understood that my 14-year marriage was about to become the most important case I'd ever worked on. And that was the moment I decided that if someone thought they could manipulate, deceive, and potentially defraud my family, they were about to discover exactly what happens when they target the wrong woman. Because here's what Garrett and his business consultant didn't know about me. They didn't know that I'd spent the last decade building a reputation as one of the most relentless financial investigators in the country. They didn't know that I had access to investigative tools, legal resources, and professional networks that could expose any deception, no matter how sophisticated. And they certainly didn't know that the moment someone threatened my family's financial security, I would use every skill I'd learned, every connection I'd made, and every strategic advantage I possessed to systematically destroy them. The war they started that night at my sister's engagement party was about to become their worst nightmare. I'm Dr. Natalie Reeves, and before I tell you how I systematically dismantled my husband's life, you need to understand exactly who he married and why that was his first critical mistake. I grew up in Bellingham, Washington, the daughter of retired Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Thomas Reeves and Superior Court Judge Amanda Reeves. My childhood dinner conversations weren't about soccer practice or school gossip. They were about criminal psychology, evidence analysis, and the methodical process of building cases that could withstand the scrutiny of federal prosecution. My father spent 32 years investigating white-collar crime, corporate fraud, and organized financial conspiracies. My mother presided over some of the most complex financial crime cases in Washington state history. From the time I was 12 years old, I knew I wanted to follow in their footsteps, but I wanted to approach it from the financial side rather than law enforcement. I earned my undergraduate degree in accounting and finance from the University of Washington, graduated summa cum laude, then went directly into a master's program in forensic accounting at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. By age 25, I'd passed the CPA exam, earned my certified fraud examiner credentials, and was working for Morrison & Associates, one of the most prestigious forensic accounting firms on the West Coast. My specialty became what the industry calls complex asset investigation, tracking money through sophisticated schemes designed to hide theft, embezzlement, and fraud. I learned to follow paper trails through offshore accounts, shell companies, and deliberately obscured transactions. I became an expert in identifying patterns that revealed systematic deception, and I developed a reputation for building cases so comprehensive that defendants typically plea bargained rather than face trial. Over the past 12 years, I've investigated cases involving everything from corporate executives who embezzled millions from employee pension funds to elaborate Ponzi schemes that defrauded hundreds of investors. I've tracked stolen assets through multiple countries, uncovered hidden real estate holdings, and exposed financial conspiracies that took years to construct but only weeks for me to dismantle once I understood the pattern. What this means, practically speaking, is that I possess investigative skills that most people never encounter in their normal lives. I know how to access financial records that most people don't even know exist. I understand legal procedures for gathering evidence that can be used in both civil and criminal proceedings. I have professional relationships with federal investigators, prosecutors, and judges who specialize in financial crimes. And perhaps most importantly, I've learned to recognize deception in its early stages, before it becomes obvious to the average person. This background is crucial to understanding what happened next, because what Garrett and Raven didn't realize was that they weren't just targeting any wealthy surgeon's wife. They were targeting someone whose entire career was built on exposing exactly the kind of sophisticated manipulation they were attempting to execute. When I met Garrett 14 years ago, I was 28 years old and already establishing myself as one of the top forensic accountants in the Pacific Northwest. He was 31, completing his orthopedic surgery residency at Seattle Presbyterian Hospital, and we met at a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital Foundation. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely impressed by my career achievements rather than intimidated by them. Our courtship was traditional and romantic. He proposed after 2 years of dating. We had a beautiful wedding at the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Seattle, and we settled into what appeared to be a perfect marriage. Garrett built his surgical practice into one of the most successful orthopedic clinics in the region. I continued advancing in my career, eventually becoming a senior partner at Morrison & Associates and developing a national reputation for complex fraud investigation. We lived in a custom-built home in the exclusive Highlands neighborhood of Seattle, with panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains. We traveled extensively, medical conferences in Europe, vacation trips to the Caribbean, skiing in Aspen during the winter months. From the outside, we appeared to be the ideal power couple, successful, sophisticated, and financially secure. But what I didn't realize until much later was that Garrett had always been somewhat insecure about our financial dynamic. While his surgical practice was extremely successful and generated substantial income, my work often involved cases with much larger dollar amounts. I regularly dealt with clients whose wealth dwarfed our personal net worth, and my professional reputation sometimes overshadowed his local prominence as a surgeon. Additionally, I had inherited significant assets from my grandmother's estate 5 years into our marriage. My grandmother, Eleanor Pemberton, had been an early investor in several technology companies that became extremely valuable over decades. When she passed away, she left me a portfolio of investments, real estate holdings, and family trusts worth approximately $4.2 million. These assets were held in my name individually, protected by the prenuptial agreement we'd signed before our wedding at the recommendation of both our families' attorneys. This inheritance created a subtle but persistent tension in our marriage. While Garrett never directly complained about the financial disparity, I began to notice changes in his behavior. He became more focused on luxury purchases and status symbols. He started talking frequently about building wealth and investment opportunities. He began expressing frustration with what he called the limitations of being a salaried surgeon, even though his income exceeded $800,000 annually. Looking back now with professional hindsight, I can see that these were early warning signs of someone becoming vulnerable to financial manipulation. Individuals who feel economically insecure despite objective success are often prime targets for sophisticated con artists who promise access to greater wealth or more prestigious investment opportunities. What I couldn't have predicted was that Garrett's growing financial insecurity would make him susceptible to someone like Raven Sterling, and that his relationship with her would eventually threaten not just our marriage, but potentially the financial security I'd spent more than a decade building. The irony, of course, is that if Garrett had simply been honest about his financial anxieties or his attraction to someone else, we could have addressed those issues through counseling or even an amicable separation. Instead, he chose deception, manipulation, and what I would soon discover was a systematic plan to access assets that weren't legally his to control. That choice would prove to be the most expensive mistake of his life, because he'd forgotten a fundamental truth about the woman he married. I spent every day of my professional life exposing people who thought they were smart enough to get away with financial deception. And I had never, not even once, failed to eventually uncover the truth. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came 3 days after Juliana's engagement party, on a Tuesday morning when I was reviewing case files in my home office. Garrett had left for the hospital unusually early, around 6:15 a.m., claiming he had an emergency surgery that had been scheduled overnight. This wasn't particularly unusual. Orthopedic surgeons often deal with trauma cases that require immediate intervention, but something about his demeanor struck me as off. He'd been checking his phone obsessively since Sunday evening, a behavior that was completely out of character for him. Garrett had always been somewhat dismissive of social media and rarely used his phone for anything beyond medical consultations and scheduling. But since the engagement party, I'd noticed him glancing at his device every few minutes, sometimes stepping away from conversations to read messages, and occasionally smiling at the screen in a way that suggested the communications were personal rather than professional. That Tuesday morning, as I watched him hurry out to his car, I made a mental note of the time and decided to do something I'd never done in 14 years of marriage. I decided to verify his story. It wasn't suspicion in the traditional sense, it was more like a professional instinct that something didn't align properly. At 8:30 a.m., I called the surgical scheduling department at Seattle Presbyterian Hospital and asked to speak with Linda Morrison, the head surgical coordinator who had worked with Garrett for over 8 years. Linda and I had met numerous times at hospital social functions, and she knew me well enough to answer a casual question about scheduling. "Hi Linda, this is Natalie Blackthorne," I said, keeping my tone light and conversational. "Garrett mentioned he had an emergency surgery this morning, and I wanted to know approximately what time he might be finished so I could plan our dinner accordingly." There was a pause on Linda's end, long enough to make me pay attention. "I'm sorry, Natalie, but Dr. Blackthorne doesn't have any surgeries scheduled for today. His first procedure is tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. "Are you sure he said today?" My stomach dropped, but I maintained my professional composure. "Oh, I must have misunderstood. You know how it is with medical schedules, everything sounds urgent when you're not in the field yourself. Thank you for clarifying." I hung up the phone and sat in my office chair, staring out the window at Elliott Bay, trying to process what I'd just learned. Garrett had lied to me about where he was going that morning, and he'd done it smoothly, convincingly, with a kind of practiced ease that suggested this wasn't the first time. As a forensic accountant, I'd learned that discovering one lie usually means there are others. People who lie about their whereabouts are typically hiding behavior they know would be unacceptable to the people closest to them. The question wasn't whether Garrett was deceiving me, the question was about what he was hiding and how long it had been going on. I decided to treat this situation like any other case I'd worked on. I would gather information systematically, document everything carefully, and avoid making assumptions until I had sufficient evidence to draw reliable conclusions. The first step was understanding Garrett's recent patterns of behavior and identifying any changes that might indicate deception. I pulled out a notebook and began reconstructing the past few weeks from memory. The engagement party had been Saturday evening. On Sunday, Garrett had received several phone calls that he'd taken privately, stepping out to the back deck or walking upstairs to his home office. When I'd asked who was calling, he'd said it was work stuff and boring medical politics. On Monday evening, he'd mentioned needing to attend a medical conference in Portland the following weekend, something he'd never mentioned before despite the fact that we typically planned our schedules weeks in advance. I realized that I'd been subconsciously noting these inconsistencies without recognizing them as a pattern. Now, viewed through the lens of potential deception, they formed a concerning picture of someone who was deliberately creating excuses to be away from home and unavailable for normal communication. The next step was understanding who Raven Sterling actually was and what her connection to my husband might be beyond the business consultation story she'd presented at the engagement party. My professional experience had taught me that when someone's background story seems superficial under questioning, it usually means the story is either partially fabricated or entirely false. I started with basic internet research, the kind of preliminary investigation that any skilled investigator would conduct when trying to verify someone's identity and credentials. I searched for Raven Sterling Business Consultant Seattle and found virtually nothing. No company website, no professional LinkedIn profile, no business registration records in Washington State's database of licensed consultants. This absence of digital footprint was itself suspicious. Legitimate business consultants, especially those working with medical professionals on investment opportunities, typically maintain robust online presences. They have websites showcasing their credentials, client testimonials, and track records. They're usually members of professional organizations and have educational backgrounds that can be verified through university records. Raven Sterling appeared to exist only as a name with no verifiable professional history, which meant either she was operating under a pseudonym or her business consultant identity was entirely fabricated. I expanded my search to include variations of the name, Raven Sterling Martinez, R. Sterling, and found a few social media profiles that might have been relevant. One Instagram account under the handle at @Ravens_consulting showed photos of a blonde woman who could have been the same person I'd met at the engagement party, but the images were carefully cropped to avoid showing faces clearly, and the account had only been active for about 6 months. The Instagram profile was particularly interesting from a professional perspective. The posts showed luxury hotels, expensive restaurants, high-end shopping locations, and exclusive resorts, all tagged with locations throughout the Pacific Northwest. But the captions were vague: building partnerships, expanding networks, investment opportunities everywhere, without any specific details about actual business activities or client relationships. What struck me as most suspicious was the pattern of locations and timing. Many of the Instagram posts were geotagged at upscale venues in Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver during business hours on weekdays. If Raven Sterling was a legitimate business consultant, she was either extremely successful to afford this lifestyle, or she was funding these experiences through some other means. I spent the rest of Tuesday morning creating what I called a preliminary profile, a basic framework for understanding who Raven Sterling might be and what her possible connection to Garrett could be. By lunchtime, I had documented enough inconsistencies and red flags to justify a more thorough investigation. That afternoon, I made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Instead of confronting Garrett directly with my suspicions, I decided to treat this as a professional case and approach it with the same methodical thoroughness I brought to corporate fraud investigations. I opened a new encrypted file on my computer and titled it Personal Investigation, GB/RS. I began documenting everything I could verify, everything I suspected, and everything I planned to investigate further. I recorded the exact times and details of Garrett's suspicious behavior, the results of my inquiry to the hospital, and my research into Raven Sterling's background. Most importantly, I established a rule for myself. I would not take any confrontational action until I understood the full scope of whatever was happening. If Garrett was having an affair, I needed to know the extent of his deception before deciding how to respond. If something more complex was occurring, financial manipulation, fraud, or systematic deception, I needed to gather evidence that would protect my legal and financial interests. What I didn't realize that Tuesday afternoon was that my decision to investigate quietly and professionally was about to uncover a deception far more sophisticated and dangerous than a simple extramarital affair. What I was about to discover would reveal that my husband wasn't just lying about where he spent his mornings. He was being systematically manipulated by someone whose expertise in deception rivaled anything I'd encountered in my professional career. And that discovery would transform me from a concerned wife into something far more dangerous, a forensic accountant with a personal stake in exposing the truth. Over the next week, I implemented what I call a systematic surveillance protocol, the same methodical approach I use when investigating corporate embezzlement, but applied to my own marriage. The goal wasn't to catch Garrett in compromising situations, but to understand the full scope of his deceptive behavior and identify patterns that would reveal what he was actually hiding. I started by analyzing our joint financial accounts with the kind of scrutiny I typically reserved for fraud cases involving millions of dollars. Garrett and I maintained separate individual accounts for personal expenses, but we also had joint checking and savings accounts for household expenses, shared investments, and major purchases. I had always trusted him to manage his personal finances responsibly, but now I needed to verify that trust was justified. What I discovered during my first detailed review of our financial records was immediately concerning. Over the past 4 months, Garrett had made several cash withdrawals from our joint account that were significantly larger than his normal spending patterns. Typically, he withdrew $200 to $300 per week for incidental expenses: coffee, lunch, gas, small purchases that he preferred to handle with cash rather than credit cards. But starting in late May, I found withdrawals of $800, $1,200, and even $1,500, always made on weekdays during business hours. When I cross-referenced these withdrawal dates with his hospital schedule, I discovered that most of them occurred on days when he had told me he was attending medical conferences, meeting with pharmaceutical representatives, or handling administrative responsibilities that kept him away from the hospital. But when I discreetly verified his actual whereabouts through Linda Morrison, I found that his hospital schedule during those periods was actually lighter than usual, not heavier. This pattern suggested that Garrett was systematically creating opportunities to be away from both his professional responsibilities and our home, and he was funding these absences with substantial amounts of cash that couldn't be easily traced through credit card records. I decided to implement electronic surveillance of his communications, something I'd never considered doing in 14 years of marriage but felt justified given the clear evidence of deception. I knew Garrett's phone passcode. We'd always share that information for practical reasons, and I had legitimate access to our family's shared cloud storage accounts where his text messages and emails were automatically backed up. What I found in his message history was far more disturbing than simple marital infidelity. Garrett had been communicating extensively with Raven Sterling for nearly 5 months, dating back to early May. Their early conversations appeared to be professional in nature, discussions about medical device investments, pharmaceutical consulting opportunities, and what Raven described as exclusive partnerships for qualified healthcare professionals. But as I read through the progression of their messages, I could see how the relationship had evolved from allegedly professional to clearly personal. Raven had gradually shifted from discussing business opportunities to making personal observations about Garrett's intelligence, his success, and what she called his undervalued potential. She frequently suggested that he deserved greater financial success and more recognition for his professional achievements. More concerning were the specific investment opportunities she had begun presenting to him. Starting in early July, Raven had started sharing what she called insider information about upcoming medical device patents, pharmaceutical stock opportunities, and real estate investments that were supposedly available only to select individuals with the right connections and sufficient capital. The messages revealed that Garrett had already committed to several of these investments, transferring money to accounts that Raven controlled for what she described as preliminary positioning in various deals. The amounts were substantial: $15,000 for a ground floor opportunity in a medical device startup, $22,000 for what she called a guaranteed return pharmaceutical stock purchase, and $8,000 for a real estate partnership that would supposedly double his investment within 6 months. As a forensic accountant who specialized in investment fraud, I recognized these patterns immediately. Raven Sterling was operating a sophisticated affinity scam, targeting medical professionals with fake investment opportunities that preyed on their desire for financial growth and their trust in someone who presented herself as an industry insider. But what made this case particularly complex was the personal relationship she had cultivated with Garrett. The messages showed that their interactions had become increasingly intimate over the summer months. She regularly told him how much she enjoyed their private consultations, how rare it was to meet someone who understood her vision for financial partnership, and how their connection was both professional and personal. By late August, their communications had become explicitly romantic. Raven was telling Garrett that she had never met anyone like him, that their partnership was special, and that she was looking forward to building something amazing together. Garrett's responses showed that he was completely infatuated with her, calling her brilliant, inspiring, and the most incredible woman he had ever met. The most damaging messages were the ones where Raven encouraged Garrett to view our marriage as an obstacle to his financial and personal growth. She suggested that I was holding him back from achieving his potential, that my success in my career made him seem less impressive, and that our prenuptial agreement was unfair because it prevented him from accessing the full value of our shared life. Reading these messages was like watching a master manipulator systematically undermine my marriage while simultaneously extracting money from my husband. Raven Sterling wasn't just having an affair with Garrett. She was executing a comprehensive psychological and financial manipulation designed to isolate him from me while gaining access to our assets. The most recent messages, sent just days before Juliana's engagement party, revealed that Raven was preparing to escalate her manipulation significantly. She had convinced Garrett that they needed to formalize their partnership, both personally and financially. She was pressuring him to divorce me so that he could access what she believed was his share of our marital assets, and she was pushing him to make much larger investments in her supposed business opportunities. One message from the morning of the engagement party was particularly revealing. "Tonight is going to be perfect, darling. After you introduce me to your family and I meet Natalie, we'll know exactly how to move forward. By Christmas, you'll be free to build the life you deserve, and our investments will be paying off beautifully. Trust me, I know exactly how to handle wives who think they're smarter than everyone else. That message made my blood run cold, because it revealed that Raven Sterling knew exactly who I was and what I did for a living. She had deliberately targeted Garrett not despite his marriage to a forensic accountant, but because of it. She believed she could manipulate him into accessing assets that were legally protected by our prenuptial agreement, and she was confident she could outmaneuver someone whose entire career was built on exposing financial fraud. I realized at that moment that I wasn't dealing with a simple affair or even a straightforward investment scam. I was dealing with someone who had specifically researched our family's financial situation, identified vulnerabilities in Garrett's psychological makeup, and designed a comprehensive plan to extract significant assets through a combination of romantic manipulation and fraudulent investment schemes. The final piece of evidence I discovered that week was a bank account statement that Garrett had hidden in his home office. The account was in his name only, opened in June at a bank where we had no other relationships. The statement showed deposits totaling nearly $40,000 from our joint accounts, followed by wire transfers of almost the same amount to various accounts controlled by Raven Sterling's investment companies. As I photographed each page of that bank statement, I realized that Garrett had already lost a substantial amount of our money to Raven's fake investment schemes. But more importantly, I understood that she was preparing to pressure him for much larger amounts, potentially including attempts to access the inheritance assets that were legally protected but which she clearly didn't understand were beyond his control. That night, I made a decision that would determine everything that followed. Instead of confronting Garrett with what I had discovered, I decided to let Raven Sterling's plan proceed while I prepared a counter-strategy that would expose her entire operation and protect our remaining assets. Because here's what Raven Sterling had miscalculated. She thought she was manipulating a successful but naive surgeon who could be easily separated from his money and his marriage. What she didn't realize was that she had chosen to target the husband of someone who spent every day of her professional life dismantling exactly the kind of sophisticated fraud she was attempting to execute. And I was about to show her what happens when you try to con a forensic accountant who has unlimited motivation to destroy you. What I discovered next fundamentally changed how I understood the threat Raven Sterling represented, not just to my marriage, but to multiple families across the Pacific Northwest. My investigation had revealed that Garrett was being systematically defrauded, but I needed to understand whether this was an isolated case or part of a larger criminal operation. I decided to use my professional resources to conduct what forensic accountants call a pattern analysis, a comprehensive investigation designed to identify whether similar fraudulent activities were occurring elsewhere. I reached out to Patricia Hendricks, my former colleague at Morrison & Associates who had transitioned to working with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Patricia specialized in tracking multi-state fraud operations, and I knew she could help me determine whether Raven Sterling was operating beyond just my husband's case. "Patricia, I need to ask you for a professional favor," I said when I called her on Thursday morning. "I've discovered what appears to be a sophisticated investment fraud targeting medical professionals, and I need to know if you've seen similar patterns in other jurisdictions." Patricia had worked with me on several complex cases over the years, and she understood immediately that I wouldn't be calling unless I had encountered something significant. "What kind of patterns are you seeing?" she asked. I described Raven Sterling's methodology without mentioning that my own husband was one of the victims, a woman presenting herself as a business consultant, targeting successful medical professionals, building romantic relationships to facilitate financial manipulation, and offering exclusive investment opportunities that appeared to be completely fraudulent. "Jesus, Natalie," Patricia said after I finished explaining. "That sounds exactly like 3 cases we've been investigating across Oregon and California. Same basic pattern: attractive woman, fake business credentials, medical professional targets, romantic manipulation combined with investment fraud. But we haven't been able to connect them definitively because the perpetrator uses different identities in each location." My heart started racing. Different identities? "Yeah, we've got a Rebecca Sterling in Portland who defrauded 2 cardiologists out of nearly $150,000. Then there's a Rachel Sterling in San Francisco who targeted orthopedic surgeons, got one guy for over $200,000 before his wife figured out what was happening. And just last month, we got reports about a Regina Sterling operating in San Diego, same methodology but targeting plastic surgeons. The scope of what I was dealing with became clear immediately. Raven Sterling wasn't just a con artist who had targeted my husband. She was operating a systematic criminal enterprise across multiple states, using variations of the same identity and targeting the same demographic of victims. Patricia, I need everything you can share about those cases, I said. And I need to know if there are any other victims who haven't been identified yet. I can share the basic case information, but why the sudden interest in this particular type of fraud? I made a decision to trust Patricia with the truth. Because my husband is currently being victimized by what I believe is the same woman, and I'm gathering evidence to stop her before she can extract more money or move on to her next target. There was a long pause before Patricia responded. Natalie, if this is personal, you need to be very careful about how you proceed. This woman, whoever she really is, has demonstrated a level of sophistication that suggests serious criminal experience. She's not just stealing money, she's psychologically manipulating her victims in ways that make them complicit in their own victimization. What do you mean? In the Portland case, the victim actually defended her when his wife tried to intervene. He was so convinced that Rebecca Sterling was a legitimate business partner who genuinely cared about him that he accused his wife of being jealous and controlling. It took months for him to accept that he'd been defrauded, and by then she had disappeared completely. This information confirmed my worst fears about Garrett's psychological state. Based on his text messages with Raven, I could see that he was already emotionally dependent on her validation and convinced that their relationship was both personally and professionally beneficial. If I confronted him directly without overwhelming evidence, he might react the same way as the Portland victim, defending Raven and viewing me as the problem. Patricia agreed to share the case files from the other jurisdictions, and what I learned over the next 2 days was both illuminating and terrifying. The woman operating under various Sterling identities had been active for at least 3 years, possibly longer. She demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of medical professional psychology, financial vulnerabilities, and social dynamics. Her methodology was remarkably consistent across all cases. She typically spent 2 to 3 months building trust through professional networking, then gradually introduced romantic elements while simultaneously presenting increasingly larger investment opportunities. She was particularly skilled at identifying physicians who felt undervalued or financially insecure despite their objective success. Most concerning was her ability to disappear completely once her victims realized they'd been defrauded. In every previous case, she had vanished without a trace. New phone numbers, closed bank accounts, no forwarding addresses, no digital footprint that could be tracked by law enforcement. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. Alright, let's get back to it. But I also discovered something that none of the previous victims had possessed: a forensic accountant's ability to trace sophisticated financial crimes and a professional network that included federal investigators, prosecutors, and financial crime specialists. The case files revealed that all of her previous victims had been isolated when they discovered the fraud. Their wives had suspected infidelity but hadn't understood the financial manipulation component. Local law enforcement had treated the cases as simple fraud complaints rather than part of a larger criminal enterprise. And none of the victims had possessed the investigative skills necessary to track her movements or expose her entire operation. I realized that I was uniquely positioned to do something that none of Raven Sterling's previous victims had been able to accomplish. I could not only stop her from victimizing my husband, but I could expose her entire criminal operation and prevent her from targeting future victims. That realization led me to make what would prove to be the most important decision of this entire investigation. Instead of simply protecting myself and Garrett, I decided to coordinate with the other victims' families to build a comprehensive case that would ensure Raven Sterling faced serious criminal consequences for her actions. I reached out to the wives of the other victims, starting with Jennifer Morrison from Portland, whose husband had lost $150,000 to Rebecca Sterling. Jennifer was a marketing executive who had documented her husband's suspicious behavior, but hadn't understood the full scope of the fraud until it was too late. Jennifer, my name is Dr. Natalie Reeves, And I'm a forensic accountant investigating a case that I believe is connected to what happened to your husband, I said when I called her Friday evening. I think the woman who defrauded your family is currently targeting mine, and I'd like to discuss coordinating our efforts to stop her. Jennifer's response was immediate and intense. You mean that bitch is still out there scamming people? I thought the FBI was handling her case. The FBI is investigating, but she's using different identities in each location, which makes it difficult to connect the cases. I have access to investigative resources that might help us track her current activities and build a case that covers all of her victims simultaneously. Over the weekend, I connected with 4 other wives whose husbands had been victimized by various sterling identities. Each woman had a different professional background, but all of them had suspected something was wrong and had tried to protect their families with limited success. What emerged from these conversations was a clear picture of how Raven Sterling operated, but also an understanding of how we could work together to expose her entire criminal enterprise. Each wife had documented different aspects of her methodology. Combined, we had evidence of a multi-state fraud operation that had stolen over $800,000 from medical professionals across the West Coast. More importantly, I realized that unlike her previous victims, we weren't discovering the fraud after she had disappeared. We were identifying her pattern while she was still actively manipulating my husband, which meant we had the opportunity to catch her in the act and gather evidence that could be used for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery. By Sunday evening, I had assembled what amounted to a task force of highly motivated, professionally skilled women who were determined to ensure that Raven Sterling would never be able to victimize another family. And we were about to demonstrate that the most dangerous thing a criminal can do is target the wrong group of wives. The task force we assembled over that weekend was unlike anything Raven Sterling could have anticipated. Each of the wives brought specific professional expertise that, when combined, created an investigative capability that rivaled what most law enforcement agencies could deploy for a single case. Jennifer Morrison from Portland was a digital marketing executive with extensive experience in social media investigation and online reputation management. She had already begun tracking Raven's various online personas and had identified patterns in her social media activity that suggested she maintained multiple identities simultaneously across different platforms. Sarah Chen from San Francisco was a corporate attorney specializing in white-collar crime defense. Her husband, Dr. Michael Chen, had lost $200,000 to Rachel Sterling, and Sarah had spent months researching the legal frameworks for prosecuting multi-jurisdictional fraud cases. She understood exactly what evidence would be needed to ensure criminal charges would stick. Diana Rodriguez from San Diego was a private investigator who ran her own firm specializing in corporate background checks and asset investigation. Her husband had been targeted by Regina Sterling just 6 weeks earlier, and Diana had been conducting her own surveillance operation to track the woman's activities and identify her real identity. Lisa Parker from Sacramento was a financial planner whose husband had lost $75,000 to a Rhonda Sterling in what appeared to be the earliest version of the scam. Lisa had documented the entire progression of her husband's manipulation and had created detailed financial records showing how the money had been extracted and where it had been transferred. Together, we possessed investigative capabilities that complemented my forensic accounting background perfectly. We could track financial crimes, conduct legal research, perform digital surveillance, investigate personal backgrounds, and coordinate with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Our first collaborative meeting was held via encrypted video conference on Sunday evening. Each woman had prepared comprehensive documentation of her husband's case, and when we combined our evidence, the scope of Raven Sterling's criminal enterprise became undeniable. Based on what we've compiled, I said, reviewing the consolidated evidence, we're looking at a minimum of $847,000 in documented fraud across 5 states over 3 years. But I suspect there are additional victims we haven't identified yet. Diana nodded from her screen. I've been tracking her movement patterns, and there are gaps in the timeline that suggest she was operating in locations we haven't discovered yet. She's too sophisticated and too consistent to have been inactive during those periods. Sarah had been analyzing the legal implications of our evidence. The good news is that we have enough documentation to support federal charges under the wire fraud statutes. The multi-state nature of her operation brings this under federal jurisdiction, which means serious prison time if we can get her arrested and prosecuted. What about asset recovery? Lisa asked. My husband's retirement account is decimated. We need to get that money back. That's where coordination becomes crucial, I explained. If we can track where she's been moving the stolen funds and identify her real assets, we can potentially recover significant amounts through civil forfeiture and restitution orders. But we need to act while she's still operating, before she disappears like she did in your cases. Jennifer had been compiling what she called a digital dossier of Raven's online presence. I've identified at least 7 different social media profiles she's maintaining simultaneously. She's using sophisticated identity management techniques, but there are patterns in her posting behavior and location data that suggest she's currently based somewhere in the Seattle area. This information aligned perfectly with what I'd observed about her presence at Juliana's engagement party and her ongoing relationship with Garrett. Unlike her previous operations, where she appeared to work quickly and then disappear, she seemed to be establishing a more permanent presence in Seattle. Why is she staying longer this time? Diana wondered. In all the previous cases, she extracted the money and vanished within 6 to 8 months. She's been working on your husband for 5 months already, and she's not showing signs of preparing to leave. I had been thinking about this question extensively. I think she's identified what she believes is a bigger target. My husband knows about my inheritance and our family's total assets. She may think that if she can manipulate him into divorcing me, she'll have access to significantly more money than her previous victims possessed. Sarah looked concerned. That would explain the escalation we're seeing in her manipulation tactics. If she thinks there are millions at stake instead of hundreds of thousands, she'll be willing to take bigger risks and invest more time in the relationship. This analysis led us to a crucial realization. Raven Sterling wasn't preparing to disappear from Seattle. She was preparing to escalate her manipulation of Garrett in ways that would potentially be more dangerous and financially devastating than anything she had attempted with previous victims. We need to move quickly, I said. But we also need to coordinate our approach carefully. If we expose her too early, she'll disappear and continue victimizing people in other locations. If we wait too long, she may succeed in manipulating Garrett into actions that could compromise our financial security permanently. Diana suggested what she called a controlled operation approach. We let her think she's succeeding with Garrett while we gather evidence and coordinate with law enforcement. We document everything she does, track every financial transaction, and build an airtight case. Then we expose her at a moment when she can't escape and when the evidence is so overwhelming that prosecution is guaranteed. Jennifer proposed using her digital marketing expertise to monitor Raven's online activities in real time. I can set up automated tracking of all her social media accounts and online communications. If she starts preparing to leave Seattle or begins targeting new victims, we'll know immediately. Lisa offered to coordinate with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit to ensure our case would be taken seriously. My contact at the Sacramento field office has been frustrated by the lack of coordination between local law enforcement agencies. If we present them with a comprehensive, multi-state case with clear evidence, they'll prioritize it. Sarah volunteered to research the legal procedures for coordinating arrests across multiple jurisdictions. If we're going to expose her, we need to ensure that law enforcement in all 5 states can take action simultaneously. We can't give her the opportunity to flee to a jurisdiction where she hasn't been identified. By the end of our Sunday evening conference, we had established what amounted to a professional investigative operation. We created secure communication channels, assigned specific responsibilities to each team member, and established protocols for sharing evidence and coordinating our activities. But most importantly, we had transformed from individual victims' wives reacting to fraud into a coordinated team of professionals proactively working to expose a criminal enterprise. We weren't just trying to protect our own families anymore. We were systematically dismantling Raven Sterling's entire operation. There's one more thing we need to consider, I said as we prepared to end the call. We need to be prepared for our husband's reactions when this becomes public. They've been psychologically manipulated for months. They're going to feel humiliated, angry, and potentially defensive when they realize they've been completely deceived. Jennifer nodded grimly. My husband still hasn't fully accepted what happened to him. Part of him still believes that Rebecca genuinely cared about him, even though the money is gone and she disappeared. That's why we need overwhelming evidence, Sarah added. We need documentation that's so comprehensive and so undeniable that there's no room for them to minimize what happened or continue believing in the fantasy relationships they thought they had. As we signed off from that call, I realized that we had accomplished something unprecedented in Raven Sterling's criminal career. For the first time, she was facing victims who possessed the skills, resources, and determination to fight back effectively. And she had no idea what was coming. The opportunity to spring our trap came sooner than expected. On Wednesday morning, I received a text message from Garrett that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. Need to talk to you tonight about a major opportunity. Raven has presented something that could change our financial future completely. This could be the investment breakthrough we've been waiting for. Reading that message, I knew that Raven Sterling was about to make her biggest move yet. Based on the patterns we'd identified from previous victims, she was preparing to push Garrett for a substantial financial commitment that would likely require accessing our joint assets or potentially even attempting to leverage our real estate holdings. I immediately contacted the task force through our secure communication channel. She's escalating. Garrett says she has a major opportunity that requires discussion tonight. This is likely her endgame approach. Diana responded within minutes. Perfect timing. I've been monitoring her digital footprint, and she's been researching real estate equity loans and asset liquidation procedures. She's definitely planning to push for access to your property holdings. Sarah added her legal perspective. If she's going to pressure him for real estate transactions or major asset transfers, she'll need to involve you directly since your name is on all the primary assets. This could be our opportunity to gather evidence while she's actively attempting the fraud. Jennifer had discovered something equally important. I've been tracking her social media activity, and she's been posting about finalizing major partnerships and exciting new ventures launching soon. She's building anticipation among her online network, which suggests she's confident this is going to succeed. Lisa provided the financial analysis that confirmed our suspicions. Based on the investment amounts she extracted from previous victims, she's probably going to request somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million. That's beyond what most people can access through normal accounts. She'll need to involve real estate or investment liquidation. I realized this was the perfect moment to implement what we had been planning, a controlled operation that would allow Raven to reveal her true intentions while we documented everything for law enforcement purposes. I'm going to let Garrett present whatever proposal she's developed, I told the team. But I'm going to record the entire conversation, and I want all of you monitoring the situation in real time. If this goes the way we expect, we should have everything we need to coordinate arrests across all jurisdictions simultaneously. That evening, Garrett came home with an energy I hadn't seen from him in years. He was excited, confident, and completely convinced that he was about to share extraordinary news with me. What he didn't realize was that I had spent the entire day coordinating with federal investigators and preparing to document his conversation with precision that would support criminal charges. I had strategically positioned recording devices throughout our living room, consulted with Sarah about the legal requirements for evidence collection, and arranged for the task force members to monitor our secure communication channel in real time as events unfolded. Natalie, I need you to sit down for this, Garrett began, his voice filled with what he clearly believed was good news. Raven has been working on something incredible for the past few months, and now she's ready to bring us in as founding partners. I maintained a neutral, interested expression while internally cataloging every word for later analysis. Tell me about it. She's developed relationships with a consortium of international medical device manufacturers who are preparing to launch revolutionary surgical technologies. The FDA approval process is nearly complete, and she's offering exclusive investment opportunities to select partners before the technologies become publicly available. As Garrett described Raven's latest fabricated investment scheme, I could see how carefully she had crafted the proposal to appeal to his professional interests and financial ambitions. She had created a story that combined his expertise in orthopedic surgery with the promise of extraordinary financial returns, making him feel both professionally validated and financially savvy. The initial partnership investment is $750,000, Garrett continued, but she's projecting returns of 400 to 500% within 18 months. Natalie, this could set us up for life. We could pay off the mortgage, fund our retirement completely, and still have more wealth than we ever imagined. There it was, the exact escalation we had predicted. Raven Sterling was requesting $750,000, an amount that would require liquidating significant assets or borrowing against our real estate holdings. That's a substantial amount, I said carefully. How does she propose we access that level of investment capital? That's the brilliant part, Garrett replied, completely unaware that he was providing evidence of attempted fraud. She's already researched our financial situation. She knows about your inheritance assets and our property values. She's identified several ways we could access the investment funds without disrupting our current lifestyle. My blood ran cold as I realized that Raven Sterling had been conducting detailed research into our personal financial situation, information that Garrett had obviously provided during their months of communication. What kind of research has she done about our finances? I asked, maintaining my calm tone while documenting his response. She's looked into home equity options, investment portfolio liquidation, and something called strategic asset repositioning, Garrett explained enthusiastically. She has connections with private banking specialists who can help us access capital quickly without the usual bureaucratic delays. I realized at that moment that Raven Sterling's operation was even more sophisticated than we had understood. She wasn't just manipulating individual victims, she was collaborating with other criminals who specialized in asset extraction and financial fraud. The private banking specialists, Garrett mentioned, were almost certainly accomplices who helped convert stolen assets into untraceable funds. Has she provided any documentation about this investment opportunity? I asked. Prospectuses, financial statements, legal agreements? She's preparing all of that, Garrett said. But she explained that because this is such an exclusive opportunity, the documentation has to be handled carefully to protect the proprietary information. She's arranging a meeting this weekend where she'll present everything formally and introduce us to the other founding partners. This information was crucial for our law enforcement coordination. Raven Sterling was planning a formal presentation that would likely involve additional criminals and provide the kind of comprehensive evidence that federal prosecutors needed for successful convictions. Where is this meeting supposed to take place? I inquired. She's reserved a private conference room at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel downtown. Saturday afternoon at 2 p.m. She said it's important that both of us attend because the legal agreements require both spouses' signatures for this level of investment. Perfect. Raven Sterling had just revealed that she was planning to gather all the evidence law enforcement would need in a single location at a specific time with multiple witnesses present. I sent a discreet message to our task force. Meeting scheduled. Saturday, 2 p.m., Fairmont Olympic Hotel. She wants both signatures. This is it. The responses came immediately. Diana, I'll coordinate surveillance positioning. Sarah, I'll contact federal prosecutors about timing arrests. Jennifer, I'll monitor all her digital communications leading up to the meeting. Lisa, I'll prepare financial evidence for immediate presentation to investigators. As Garrett continued describing his excitement about the investment opportunity, I realized that Raven Sterling had made the same fatal error that brought down most sophisticated criminals. She had become overconfident in her abilities and underestimated her opposition. She thought she was manipulating a naive surgeon and his wealthy wife into a straightforward financial fraud. What she didn't realize was that she had provided a team of highly motivated, professionally skilled women with exactly the opportunity we needed to destroy her entire criminal operation. Saturday afternoon was going to be very different from what she was expecting. Saturday afternoon arrived with the crisp clarity of a Pacific Northwest autumn day. I had spent the morning coordinating final details with our task force and federal investigators, ensuring that every element of our operation would proceed flawlessly. Agent Patricia Hendricks had assembled a team from the FBI's Seattle field office, and investigators from Portland, San Francisco, and San Diego were standing by to execute coordinated arrests once we had documented Raven Sterling's fraud attempt in progress. I dressed carefully for the meeting, selecting a professional navy suit that projected both success and authority. I needed to appear as the wealthy, sophisticated investor's wife that Raven Sterling expected to manipulate, while simultaneously maintaining the composure necessary to document criminal activity for federal prosecutors. Garrett was unusually nervous that morning, spending extra time on his appearance and rehearsing what he clearly believed would be the most important business presentation of his life. He had no idea that he was about to walk into a federal law enforcement operation designed to expose the woman he thought loved him as a career criminal who had been systematically defrauding him for months. "Are you ready for this, darling?" he asked as we prepared to leave for downtown Seattle. "This could literally change everything for us." "I'm very interested to hear what Raven has to say," I replied, which was absolutely true, though not in the way Garrett imagined. We arrived at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel at 1:45 p.m. The conference room Raven had reserved was on the mezzanine level, an elegant space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. She had clearly chosen the location to impress her victims and create an atmosphere of legitimate business sophistication. Diana Rodriguez was already positioned in the hotel lobby, disguised as a business traveler reviewing documents while monitoring everyone who entered the conference room area. Jennifer Morrison had established herself in the hotel's restaurant with a clear sight line to the mezzanine level, equipped with high-resolution cameras to document the attendees. Lisa Parker was coordinating with federal agents positioned outside the hotel, ready to prevent anyone from leaving once the fraud documentation was complete. Raven Sterling arrived precisely at 2 p.m., accompanied by two men I had never seen before. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored cream-colored suit, carrying an expensive leather briefcase, and projecting the confident elegance of someone accustomed to closing major business deals. Her companions were equally well-dressed, appearing to be exactly the kind of private banking specialists she had described to Garrett. "Dr. Blackthorne, Natalie, I'm so excited you could both join us today," Raven said, embracing Garrett with the kind of familiar warmth that made my stomach turn, knowing what I knew about her true intentions. "This is going to be an extraordinary afternoon." She introduced her companions as Marcus Whitfield and Jonathan Sterling, claiming they were investment specialists who had developed the medical device portfolio she wanted us to join. Based on our investigation, I suspected these were aliases for accomplices who specialized in converting fraudulent investments into untraceable assets. "Before we begin," Raven announced, "I want everyone to understand the confidential nature of what we'll be discussing today. The investment opportunities we're presenting are available to only a select group of founding partners, and the financial projections I'll be sharing are proprietary information that could be extremely valuable to competitors." This confidentiality requirement was classic fraud methodology, creating artificial scarcity and secrecy to prevent victims from seeking outside verification of the investment claims. Raven began her presentation with a sophisticated PowerPoint display showing medical device prototypes, FDA approval timelines, and projected market penetrations that appeared remarkably professional. She had clearly invested significant time and resources in creating convincing documentation for her fraudulent schemes. "The total market opportunity we're targeting is approximately $2.8 billion over the next 5 years, she explained, displaying charts that looked like they could have come from legitimate pharmaceutical companies. "Our consortium has identified breakthrough technologies in joint replacement, surgical instrumentation, and diagnostic imaging that are positioned to capture significant market share." As she spoke, I discreetly recorded everything while simultaneously sending status updates to our law enforcement team. The presentation was exactly what federal prosecutors needed: a sophisticated, detailed fraud attempt targeting specific victims for substantial amounts of money. "The investment structure is designed to maximize returns while minimizing risk exposure," Marcus Whitfield added, presenting legal documents that appeared legitimate but which I knew Sarah Chen had already identified as fraudulent based on similar materials used with previous victims. Dr. Blackthorne, your medical expertise makes you an ideal founding partner, Jonathan Sterling continued. Your understanding of surgical procedures and hospital purchasing decisions provides invaluable strategic insight for our market positioning. I watched Garrett's face as they systematically flattered his professional expertise while simultaneously building toward their financial request. He was completely convinced that this was a legitimate opportunity being presented by people who genuinely valued his contributions. The initial partnership investment is $750,000, as we discussed, Raven said, finally reaching the critical moment. But based on our financial analysis of your assets, we believe you're positioned to participate at an even higher level if you're interested in maximizing your returns. She produced additional documentation showing investment tiers that ranged up to $1.5 million, with correspondingly higher projected returns for larger investments. We've prepared preliminary agreements that would allow you to access the necessary capital through strategic asset repositioning, Marcus explained, presenting documents that I recognized as fraudulent loan applications designed to extract equity from our real estate holdings. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Clear evidence of attempted fraud targeting our specific assets, documented in the presence of multiple witnesses and federal law enforcement. These investment agreements look quite comprehensive, I said, reviewing the documents while photographing key pages discreetly. But I'm curious about the verification procedures for the FDA approvals and market projections you've presented. Raven's confident expression flickered slightly. What kind of verification did you have in mind? As a forensic accountant, I'm trained to validate financial claims before making significant investments, I replied, watching her face carefully. I'd like to independently verify the FDA submission status, review the actual patent filings, and examine the financial statements of the manufacturing partners you mentioned. The two men exchanged glances that confirmed my suspicions about their criminal experience. Legitimate investment advisors would welcome due diligence questions. Criminals became nervous when asked to provide verifiable documentation. Natalie, I think you might be overthinking this, Garrett interjected, clearly concerned that my questions might jeopardize what he believed was an exclusive opportunity. Raven has already done extensive research on these investments. I understand your caution, Raven said, recovering her composure quickly. But the confidential nature of these opportunities means that traditional verification procedures aren't possible until after the partnership agreements are executed. That statement was exactly what I needed for criminal prosecution, a clear attempt to prevent victims from conducting due diligence that would expose the fraudulent nature of the investment claims. I sent a final message to our law enforcement team, full fraud documentation complete. Execute arrests. Within 30 seconds, FBI agents entered the conference room from multiple entrances, with Agent Patricia Hendricks leading the team. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Patricia announced, displaying her credentials. Everyone in this room needs to remain seated with your hands visible. Raven Sterling's face went completely pale as she realized that her carefully orchestrated fraud presentation had become a federal arrest operation. Marcus Whitfield attempted to reach for his briefcase but was immediately restrained by agents. Jonathan Sterling simply sat in stunned silence as handcuffs were applied. Raven Sterling, also known as Rebecca Sterling, Rachel Sterling, Regina Sterling, and Rhonda Sterling, Patricia continued, you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes across multiple federal jurisdictions. As the agents read Raven her rights, I watched Garrett's face transform from confusion to horror to devastating realization. Everything he had believed about his relationship with Raven Sterling, everything he had convinced himself about their business partnership and personal connection, was collapsing in real time. And this was only the beginning of the consequences he would face for his months of deception and betrayal. The aftermath of Raven Sterling's arrest unfolded with the swift efficiency of a federal law enforcement operation that had been months in the planning. Within hours of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel arrests, coordinated raids were executed across 5 states, targeting the network of accomplices and financial institutions that had enabled her multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Agent Patricia Hendricks briefed me on the scope of what they had uncovered as we sat in the FBI's Seattle field office later that evening. Natalie, what you and your task force documented goes far beyond what we initially suspected. Raven Sterling, whose real name is Victoria Ann Blackwood, has been operating this scheme for over 6 years across 12 states. The total amount of documented fraud exceeds $3.2 million, with at least 23 confirmed victims. The financial evidence was staggering. Victoria had maintained sophisticated money laundering operations that moved stolen funds through offshore accounts, cryptocurrency exchanges, and shell companies designed specifically to make asset recovery nearly impossible. The investment opportunities she presented to victims were completely fabricated, but the supporting documentation was so professionally crafted that even experienced investors had been deceived. The two men arrested with her, Marcus Whitfield and Jonathan Sterling, are career criminals with extensive experience in financial fraud, Patricia continued. Whitfield specializes in creating fraudulent loan documentation and false financial statements. Sterling, who is actually Victoria's brother, handles the money laundering and asset concealment operations. What made Victoria's operation particularly devastating was her psychological manipulation techniques. FBI behavioral analysts had determined that she specifically targeted successful professionals who were experiencing midlife insecurities or marital dissatisfaction. She had studied psychology extensively and was skilled at identifying emotional vulnerabilities that made her victims susceptible to both romantic and financial manipulation. Dr. Blackthorne's case was actually unusual, Patricia explained. Most of her previous victims were divorced or separated by the time she finished extracting their money. She typically destroyed their marriages as part of isolating them from support systems that might interfere with her fraud schemes. The evidence we had gathered during our investigation proved crucial for federal prosecutors. Unlike previous cases where Victoria had successfully disappeared before law enforcement could build comprehensive cases, our task force had provided documentation that covered every aspect of her criminal operation. Your husband's case will be central to the prosecution, Patricia told me. The recorded conversations, financial documentation, and coordination with the other victims' families created the most comprehensive fraud case our office has seen in years. But while the criminal justice system moved forward with prosecuting Victoria Blackwood and her accomplices, the personal consequences for the victims and their families were only beginning to unfold. Garrett's reaction to learning the truth about Raven Sterling was more devastating than I had anticipated. During the car ride home from the FBI office, he sat in complete silence, staring out the passenger window with an expression of such profound shame and disbelief that I almost felt sorry for him. "How long have you known?" he finally asked as we pulled into our driveway. "I've been investigating for 3 weeks," I replied. "But I suspected something was wrong the morning you lied about having emergency surgery." The realization that I had known about his deception for weeks while he continued lying to me daily seemed to shatter something fundamental in his understanding of our relationship. "Natalie, I thought she loved me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought we had something real, something special. I thought she saw potential in me that you had stopped seeing years ago." This confession revealed the depth of Victoria's psychological manipulation. She had convinced Garrett that his marriage to me was holding him back from achieving his true potential, both financially and personally. She had systematically undermined his confidence in our relationship while building his dependence on her validation and approval. "How much money did you give her?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from my investigation. $47,000, he admitted. But she promised it would generate returns that would more than compensate for the initial investment. She showed me documentation, financial projections, testimonials from other successful partners. All fabricated, all designed to exploit his desire for financial success and his growing insecurity about our marriage's financial dynamics. The professional consequences for Garrett were immediate and severe. Seattle Presbyterian Hospital launched an internal investigation into his conduct after learning about his involvement in a federal fraud case. While he hadn't committed any crimes himself, his judgment had been so thoroughly compromised that the hospital administration questioned his fitness for surgical responsibilities that required clear decision-making under pressure. Dr. Blackthorne, we need to discuss your immediate professional status, Dr. James Richardson, the chief of surgery, told Garrett during a meeting the following Monday. The hospital's board of directors has concerns about the judgment issues revealed by your involvement in this fraud case. Garrett was placed on administrative leave pending a comprehensive review of his professional conduct. His surgical privileges were suspended, his patient appointments were transferred to other physicians, and his reputation within the medical community was severely damaged. The personal consequences were equally devastating. Our marriage, which had already been undermined by months of his deception and emotional infidelity, could not survive the revelation of how completely he had been manipulated by another woman. I can't stay married to someone who was so easily deceived, I told him during one of our final conversations about our relationship. It's not just the money, Garrett. It's that you believed everything she told you about me, about our marriage, about your own worth. You let a criminal convince you that I was the problem in your life. What hurt most wasn't his infidelity, it was his willingness to believe Victoria's narrative that I was holding him back from achieving his potential. After 14 years of supporting his career, celebrating his successes, and building a life together, he had chosen to trust a stranger who told him he deserved better than what we had created together. The divorce proceedings were handled efficiently through our respective attorneys. Because of the prenuptial agreement and the clear documentation of his financial misconduct, there were no contested issues regarding asset division. Garrett kept his individual retirement accounts and personal assets, while I retained the real estate, inheritance investments, and business interests that had always been legally mine. But the broader consequences of Victoria Blackwood's fraud operation extended far beyond our individual marriage. The task force we had assembled continued working with federal investigators to identify additional victims and recover stolen assets. Over the following months, we helped law enforcement uncover an entire network of criminal operations targeting wealthy professionals across multiple industries. What you've accomplished goes beyond just stopping one con artist, Agent Hendricks told me during a follow-up meeting 6 months after Victoria's arrest. Your investigation techniques and coordination methods are being studied by financial crimes units across the country. You've essentially created a template for how victims can fight back against sophisticated fraud operations. The criminal trial began 8 months after Victoria's arrest. She was convicted on 47 counts of wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy charges. The federal judge sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison and ordered restitution payments totaling $3.2 million to all documented victims. Her brother Jonathan received 12 years for his role in the money laundering operation. Marcus Whitfield pleaded guilty to fraud conspiracy charges and received 8 years in federal prison. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was the asset recovery operation. Federal investigators had traced most of Victoria's stolen funds to accounts she had established under various false identities. Because of our comprehensive documentation and the speed of the arrests, law enforcement was able to freeze her assets before she could transfer them to offshore locations. Dr. Reeves, we've recovered approximately 78% of the funds stolen from all victims, Agent Hendricks informed me during a final meeting. Your husband's $47,000 loss has been fully recovered, plus interest and penalties that Victoria will pay as part of her restitution agreement. The money recovery was important, but it wasn't the most significant outcome of our investigation. What mattered most was that Victoria Blackwood would never be able to victimize another family, and that the investigative methods our task force had developed were being used to identify and stop other similar criminal operations. Justice had been served, comprehensively and permanently. 2 years after Victoria Blackwood's conviction, I stood in the conference room of Reeves Financial Investigation Services, the consulting firm I had established to help other victims of sophisticated fraud schemes. The mahogany table was surrounded by the same women who had formed our original task force, but now we were meeting as business partners rather than desperate wives seeking justice. Ladies, I want to review what we've accomplished since we formalized our partnership, I said, looking around at faces that had become as familiar as family over the past 24 months. Jennifer Morrison had transitioned from digital marketing into cybersecurity consulting, specializing in online fraud detection for financial institutions. We've identified and helped prosecute 12 additional cases of romance-based investment fraud in the past year alone, she reported. The digital forensics techniques we developed during Victoria's investigation have become industry standard for tracking sophisticated online manipulation. Sarah Chen had left her corporate law practice to focus exclusively on financial crimes prosecution. She now served as a consultant for federal prosecutors handling complex fraud cases across multiple jurisdictions. The legal framework we established for coordinating multi-state fraud prosecutions has been adopted by the Department of Justice as a template for similar cases, she added. We've essentially revolutionized how law enforcement approaches organized financial crimes. Diana Rodriguez had expanded her private investigation firm to specialize in asset recovery for fraud victims. In the past 18 months, we've recovered over $8 million in stolen assets for families victimized by similar schemes, she announced. The investigative protocols we developed have been so effective that we now have a 6-month waiting list of clients. Lisa Parker had become a nationally recognized expert in financial fraud education, conducting seminars for professional associations and financial institutions about identifying and preventing sophisticated manipulation schemes. We've trained over 3,000 financial advisors, attorneys, and medical professionals to recognize the warning signs of the fraud patterns we uncovered, she said. Early intervention is preventing countless families from experiencing what we went through. Our transformation from victims to advocates had been organic and inevitable. Once we had successfully exposed Victoria Blackwood's operation, we realized that our combined expertise represented a unique resource for other families facing similar threats. We had learned to fight back effectively against criminals who typically operated with impunity, and we felt obligated to share that knowledge with others. The most important statistic, I said, reviewing our case files, is that we've prevented an estimated $12 million in potential fraud by identifying and stopping criminal operations before they could victimize their intended targets. Our success had attracted attention from federal law enforcement agencies, academic researchers studying financial crimes, and media organizations interested in how ordinary people could fight back against sophisticated criminals. We had been featured in documentaries, congressional hearings on financial fraud prevention, and professional conferences about victim advocacy. But beyond our professional achievements, the most significant transformation had been personal. Each of us had discovered strength, intelligence, and capabilities we hadn't known we possessed. We had learned that the most devastating betrayals could become the foundation for extraordinary growth and empowerment. I need to share something with all of you, I said, setting down the quarterly report I had been reading. 6 months ago, I was contacted by Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist from Denver whose husband had been targeted by what appeared to be a variation of Victoria's scheme. But this case was different. The woman targeting Dr. Foster's husband was using psychological manipulation techniques that went beyond anything we had encountered. The room became silent as I described the new case. Dr. Foster's investigation revealed that her husband's manipulator was actually a licensed therapist who had been using her professional training to exploit vulnerable clients. She wasn't just stealing money, she was systematically destroying her victims' mental health while extracting their financial resources. Sarah leaned forward with interest. Are you suggesting we expand our focus beyond romance-based investment fraud? I'm suggesting we've identified something much larger than we initially realized, I replied. Victoria Blackwood was part of a broader criminal ecosystem that includes professional manipulators with various specializations. Therapists who exploit patients, financial advisors who defraud clients, clergy who abuse congregational trust, all using similar psychological manipulation techniques for financial gain. Jennifer immediately understood the implications. If we could identify and expose these patterns across different professional contexts, we could help law enforcement understand how organized psychological manipulation really works. Diana was already thinking about investigative applications. We have the expertise to track these criminals across professional boundaries. Most law enforcement agencies specialize in specific types of crimes, but we understand the underlying manipulation techniques that cross all jurisdictions. Lisa nodded enthusiastically. This could be the foundation for a comprehensive victim advocacy organization that addresses professional manipulation in all its forms. Over the following months, we expanded Reeves' financial investigation services into the Institute for Professional Manipulation Prevention, a non-profit organization dedicated to identifying, exposing, and prosecuting criminals who use their professional credentials to exploit victims. Our work attracted funding from private foundations, federal grants supporting victim advocacy, and donations from families we had helped. We hired additional investigators, attorneys, and psychological consultants who specialized in understanding and combating professional manipulation. What we've learned, I explained during a presentation to the National Association of Attorneys General, is that sophisticated manipulation follows predictable patterns regardless of the professional context. Whether it's a fake investment advisor targeting wealthy retirees, a corrupt therapist exploiting vulnerable patients, or a romance scammer targeting lonely professionals, the underlying psychological techniques are remarkably consistent. The Institute developed training programs for law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and professional licensing boards that help them identify and investigate manipulation-based crimes more effectively. We created educational resources for potential victims that taught them to recognize early warning signs of professional manipulation before significant damage occurred. But perhaps most importantly, we had created a support network for families experiencing what we had endured. When someone discovered that their spouse was being manipulated by a sophisticated criminal, they no longer had to face that crisis alone. They could contact the Institute and receive guidance from people who understood exactly what they were experiencing. Every week, we receive calls from wives, husbands, adult children, and close friends who suspect that someone they love is being manipulated by a professional criminal, I told a congressional committee investigating financial fraud prevention. Because of the resources we've developed, these families can take action quickly and effectively instead of watching helplessly while their loved ones are systematically destroyed. As for my personal life, the transformation had been equally profound. The house in the Highlands neighborhood had become headquarters for the Institute, with conference rooms where we met with new clients and investigators. The home that had once represented the failure of my marriage now symbolized the success of turning devastating betrayal into meaningful advocacy. I had not remarried, though I had developed close friendships and professional relationships that were more fulfilling than anything I had experienced during my marriage to Garrett. I had learned that my identity and worth were not dependent on romantic relationships, but on my ability to use my skills and experience to help others. Garrett had eventually moved to Portland, where he had found a position at a smaller hospital and was slowly rebuilding his medical career. We occasionally exchanged professional communications when his expertise was relevant to cases involving medical professionals, but our personal relationship was permanently concluded. The most important lesson we can share, I said during my final presentation to the task force that had become my closest friends and business partners, is that being victimized by sophisticated criminals doesn't define us. How we choose to respond to that victimization does. We had transformed from isolated victims reacting to betrayal into a coordinated force for justice that was preventing other families from experiencing similar trauma. We had learned to turn our pain into purpose, our anger into advocacy, and our individual experiences into collective strength. To anyone listening to this story who suspects that someone they love is being manipulated by a professional criminal, I concluded, remember that you are not powerless. You have resources, capabilities, and legal protections that you may not realize. Most importantly, you don't have to fight alone. There are people who understand exactly what you're experiencing, and we're here to help. Because that's what we learned from our battle with Victoria Blackwood. The most dangerous thing a criminal can do is target a group of intelligent, determined people who refuse to be victims. And once we learned how to fight back effectively, we made it our mission to ensure that no other family would have to face that fight unprepared. Justice isn't just about punishing criminals, it's about ensuring they can never victimize anyone else again. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.